So, Cleve, there's one portion of your biography that I didn't know about, and that is that you have labeled yourself a cheesesteak enthusiast. I think I've also seen cheesesteak connoisseur. Can you just tell me a little bit about how that enthusiasm manifests itself? What do you do to show your appreciation for the cheesesteak?
Okay, so first of all, let's make sure my doctor is not listening to this. if you're listening, just turn it off. I'm from Chester, just south of Philly. So, that is manna from heaven for me. It's the most delicious thing ever. The way that I think it manifests the most is that I've gotten every single person that I know, from my wife to my friends to my baby who's just into solid foods, to begin enjoying cheesesteaks. And now I hope his doctor isn't listening either.
I was going to say, how old is your baby, and is red meat on the menu?
The baby is 1.
Okay.
The pediatrician says he should eat what we eat.
Okay. And for you, that's cheesesteaks.
And we eat cheese. And we eat cheesesteaks.
Welcome to the Campaign Moment from the Washington Post. I'm Aaron Blake, senior political reporter and author of the Campaign Moment newsletter. It is Wednesday, October 16th. That means there's now less than 3 weeks to go until Election Day. Right now, we're watching a lot of activity on the campaign trail. Donald Trump was in Pennsylvania on Monday holding a town hall-style event that became a very different scene. There were a couple medical emergencies in the crowd, and Donald Trump, after that, decided not to take any more questions, but instead he stood on the stage swaying and dancing to music for 39 minutes. Kamala Harris, meanwhile, is doing her first interview on Wednesday with Fox News. That will be airing at 6 p.m., which is after this podcast will be in your feeds. This will also be happening in Pennsylvania, a key battleground state. But today I wanted to dive into something that's causing a lot of anxiety for Democrats on the campaign trail right now. And that's why I wanted to bring in Cleve Wootson, who has been covering Kamala Harris for a very long time. Hey, Cleve.
Hey, it could be a combative interview for somebody that's been accused of not taking combative interviews.
I think it's going to be very much worth watching, and I'm sure that we'll get to that on Friday along with some of these other stories from the Trump campaign. But right now, I wanted to talk about something that's causing some real anxiety with Democrats and the Harris campaign, and that is specifically her performance among Black voters and specifically among Black men. This has been a real focus for her campaign in recent days. We've seen some polling that shows her struggling to match how Democrats generally do with these voters. Cleve, can you start by, no demographic group is a monolith, but there are certain patterns that we've kind of come to expect in campaigns. One of those is that Black voters overwhelmingly generally support the Democratic candidate.
Yeah.
But can you tell me about just how much they have and how much Democrats have come to count on those votes?
Yeah, I think that's the one sentence way of summing this up. It's a group that Kamala Harris and Democrats expected to be there that is not there in the numbers that they expected. African-American voters have, overwhelmingly favored Democrats in the last few decades. They showed up in large numbers for President Biden, both in the primary and in the general election in 2020. And the recent polls have just shown that Kamala Harris is ticking just low of Biden when it comes to Black men. But these are voters that, it could be argued, saved Biden's campaign and then helped put him into the White House. And now that you have a candidate of color, a Black woman that is running, there's questions about how loyal they are to her and to the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and I think we've seen some real striking numbers on this in recent days. We often see polls and they'll break out different demographic groups, but a lot of those subsamples in the poll will be pretty small. But we have seen in recent days some larger samples of Black voters. We saw a New York Times Siena College poll that showed Donald Trump winning 15% of Black voters. That would be 6 points more than he got in 2020 and more than any Republican since the 1970s. He was also winning 20% of Black men, which is a number that I think stuck out for a lot of people and that we're going to talk about here. I wondered, Cleve, if you can trace this to something in particular, like why are Black voters and maybe especially Black men not more excited about a Black female nominee at the top of the ticket?
Well, how deep do you want to go there?
Let's go deep.
Okay. The first kind of asterisk I'll put in this is kind of what you've already said. No voting group is a monolith, right? And so really the only way to get at this is to talk to voter after voter after voter after voter. And I've talked to dozens, if not hundreds, of black men over the last 4 years about what the Biden administration has done for them, about what Democrats have done for them, about how they feel about Trump, about that whole taken for granted argument that Republicans make, that Democrats take black voters and black men for granted because they've just always been there. And I just think that there's a number of issues. With Kamala Harris, one of the sort of self-bias checks that we always have to sort of make is sexism at play? In a lot of these conversations, I really try to understand the biases of the people that I'm talking to, because they take those biases, whether they're right or wrong or politically correct or not, they take those biases into the voting booth and they do affect their behaviors. But I also think that a lot of the voters that I've talked to, one of the things they grapple with, if you're looking for a through line, is whether voting for Democrats is something that is an obligation or sort of something that is an honor to do or that history tells them they have to do, or if it should be as transactional as it is with other voting groups. Is it, my forebears have fought and in some cases died to give me the right to vote, and, this party helps me with my best interests or whatever? Or is it, what have you done for me lately? And can I tell by what you've done for me lately what you will deliver for me going forward?
Mm-hmm. Cleve, can you talk a little bit more about what they see as not having been done? What are there specific policies that they like that they haven't seen, or did they have expectations from Biden being elected that haven't been met in certain ways?
Again, it'll vary from person to person or region to region.
Yeah.
I think that if you look at the Biden-Harris administration's record on race, their argument is that a lot of the things that benefit black men or benefit black people writ large are sort of baked into these large bills that kind of benefit everybody, like the Inflation Reduction Act or the Infrastructure Bill, the American Rescue Plan, and that some of it is also baked into the symbolism of having a first black Supreme Court justice or a first black woman to be vice president. But a lot of black men that I've talked to, not all of them, but a through line is, okay, this stuff is great, but what is there that is specifically for us? Can you point to a policy that is specifically for African-American men?
I think we should note, we're talking about how a demographic is not a monolith. We should also note that a demographic is a portion of the electorate. And so while Harris's campaign appears to be struggling more than your usual Democrat with black voters and also Hispanic voters, she's doing better than a Democrat generally does with white women, for instance. There's some polling that suggests that group is basically a tie. This is a group that Mitt Romney won in 2012 by 9 points. So that's a sizable shift. And it's a shift in a bigger demographic group than the ones we're talking about here. White women are more than 1/3 of the electorate versus black men are 4 to 5% in the last couple presidential elections. So we do see these demographic groups kind of shifting, and that's happened a lot in the Trump era. And I just wonder if the Harris campaign, with the focus that we're seeing on black voters in particular, if this is a recognition that this is a really big problem relative to these other demographics that might have moved in her favor.
I mean, I think that might be spot on. Look, we're going to be having a conversation on a podcast 3 weeks from now where we're parsing these exact numbers, right? But I think one of the things that we do know now is that it's not just who votes for Harris, but it's who votes for Harris where. So if the problem with black male voters, for example, is an issue that plays out in Philadelphia, a Democratic hotbed, a reliable bucket of votes for Democrats for years, or in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, then that may be some of the numbers that they're looking at, where there's a problem writ large with African-American men being there for Harris, but specifically in specific areas like Michigan, where Magic Johnson made a pitch to black men.
Our black men, we got to get them out to vote. That's number one.
To get involved and to vote and all of that stuff.
Kamala's opponent promised a lot of things last time to the black community. that he did not deliver on. We got to make sure we help black men understand that.
Those specific numbers and how that plays out in key counties in key states might be one of the issues that they're looking at. Could that be offset? Of course. Harris has heavily leaned into abortion access and abortion rights as a means of motivating women to vote, and it is shown to be effective in the midterms. The polling seems to be on their side in that regard, but it's also a margin of error race. And every single one of these votes, specifically in these places, in these key battleground states, in these key counties, matter a lot.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of women, I also wanted to get into this gender split that we're seeing in some of the polling here. And that's that black men seem to be a lot more likely to support Donald Trump than black women. Black women are pretty much like we're accustomed to seeing them voting for a Democratic presidential ticket. What do you make of that split and kind of the competing desires of black men versus black women?
I think I have a little bit of pushback on just a lot more likely. I'd have to see the specific numbers for the specific polls. But I will talk about what I do know. Like in my conversations with people, I don't know that for a lot of black men it is like, I'm not too sure about Kamala Harris. I'm going to vote for Donald Trump, as much as it is, I'm not too sure about Kamala Harris. I think I'm going to sit out. Because for a lot of folks, it's not necessarily a binary choice. There are actually three decisions. It is vote for one, vote for the other, or just don't vote at all. And I also think that some of the pushback in the black community comes from this argument where they're looking at a small segment of the electorate, black men, as sort of costing Democrats the race, but not looking at, segments of white women or white men or whatever. Democrats blaming black voters for not delivering, but not looking at other subsets of voters or other groups of voters for that. It's just like slight pushback.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I also wanted to get into something we've talked about, which is what the Harris campaign is doing about this now. So we'll talk about that after the break. So, Cleve, you and I were talking a little bit before the show about how there seemed to be a real change in how Kamala Harris talks about these issues. There seems to be much more of an explicit focus on these things, just the way she talks about black issues. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting and fascinating for really prominent black candidates. Because I think Obama definitely tried to do this, and Harris does this as well in trying to be, at least in speaking, a president for all people. Some would argue, post-racial. It's
post-racial,
not,
yeah.
I am going to be a black woman vice president. It is, I am the best person who can be president or who will be president. It is not about my race. It is what I'm going to deliver for people of all races. And I think that early on in this truncated campaign, Harris has been not shying away from her identity, but it wasn't just talking about what she's going to do for black people or one subset of black people. And then I listened to the podcast with Charlemagne.
This was an audio town hall featuring Charlemagne the God, who is, of course, the host of the wildly popular show, The Breakfast Club.
Yeah, he also has Charlemagne the God has a history of kind of getting provocative moments out of the campaign. If you remember the Biden saying, if you're not voting for me, you ain't black.
Yes, that was on his show.
Who was he talking to? Yeah.
Yep.
How are you? Because you did just walk in. You was kind of late, so.
Well, I try to be on time. Apparently, I'm 40 seconds late. You're right.
Well, you are black, so okay. Now.
And I was just struck by just the number of times Kamala Harris said the word black.
I grew up in the black church. Targeted black voters, certain populations, and specifically black men. Mm-hmm. Knowing that black people are 40% less likely to be homeowners in America, and we reduce black child poverty in America by 50%.
She can say the word black. That's fine. That's in her wheelhouse. She's fine. But, there was nothing pejorative. But it just seems to be a shift of sorts from talking about this sort of identity that I'm going to benefit everybody to specifically targeting black men and saying this is how I'm going to benefit you. This is how I'm going to help you. Oh, and by the way, these are ways that Donald Trump has not benefited you and is not going to help you. Race is one of the most divisive issues in America, right? If not the most divisive issue in America. And the way that candidates sort of wade into and out of it can be really, illustrative, not just of the fissures, but also of the sort of strategy that they're employing to try to get folks to vote. And Harris saying just, I'm going to benefit this subset of the Democratic electorate, this subset of the American population, just is really telling about how they see those numbers and where they see those threats.
You look at something like that and you almost see an acknowledgement that what they were doing before wasn't working. Obviously a campaign strategy shifts throughout the course of a campaign and you changed tacks, but I think this is a really significant one. So speaking of strategic choices, I was really struck last week by what appeared to be a strategic choice employed by Barack Obama. He was talking directly to black men in a pretty unvarnished way.
I also want to say that seems to be more pronounced with the brothers. So if you don't mind, just for a second, I'm going to speak to y'all directly.
Made some comments about how they're coming up with all kinds of excuses not to support Harris.
And so now you're thinking about sitting out or even supporting somebody who has a history of denigrating you?
He suggested that the reason they weren't doing that is because they weren't feeling the idea of having a woman president.
Because you think that's a sign of strength? Because that's what being a man is? Putting women down? That's not acceptable.
Cleve, I wanted to get your take on this, which we talked about on Friday's show a little bit, but only briefly, because as I mentioned, I was really struck by this. I heard these comments and I'm like, oh, they're seeing something in the polls or they made a strategic decision here. Like this had to have come from somebody in a position of decision making because this is a pretty remarkable thing for Obama to say. I think could be read as him talking down to people or admonishing people. Like it seemed to be a real moment and I wanted to see what your take on it was.
Yeah, or takes. I have a lot of takes.
Let's go with multiple
on
takes.
That.
Yes.
Yeah. The first thing that I think the context that matters is that I think of Obama not just as the most popular Democrat, but also Kamala Harris's friend, somebody that has her phone number, that talks to her regularly and repeatedly. So to me, I put more shrift into this, not just because of, who Obama is, but also because of who he's talking to. And it seems like this sort of reflects that anxiety, that worry, that fear about this demographic group. And a lot of times you hear things that the campaign won't say directly or in an unvarnished way that are said by surrogates. In this case, probably the most popular surrogate that there is.
Right. It gives them kind of the plausible deniability that this is actually their campaign message, but it also gets that message out there.
That's just Obama speaking. We know
exactly.
we're with you. We know you're with us or whatever. So
we wouldn't talk to you like that.
Yes, exactly. And so I see this. I'm more inclined to see this as a campaign message that the campaign can't say. I think that Obama's words, while they may resonate with certain members of the electorate, with certain black men, I also as a person who's talked to just a lot of voters about what they want from a political party, what they want government to deliver them, about what they feel government is not delivering to them, it did sort of have that, can I say lecturing uncle at Thanksgiving vibe to it?
I think that's fair.
I'm a little younger than Obama. I have uncles that have given me similar speeches, but I think that a lot of black people, because of the history of race and the history of voting and the history of progress in our country, have very strong feelings about the duty and the obligation to vote, and to vote in what people would say is the right way, right? And I think that Obama is leaning very, very heavily into that and saying that you should, basically cast a ballot for Kamala Harris, warts and all, put your reservations aside. He's also making a not so subtle argument about sexism?
Right.
Are you putting a black woman down because of whatever? Are you coming up with other excuses that are a pretext? But I also think that for some folks that I've talked to, it's a little dismissive of their right to have expectations from their government. There are people who just say, it is my right to vote, but it is the politician's job or government's job to explain to me why I should vote for them. I think that while I understand the message and that a lot of folks in the black community, I'm trying not to speak as a monolith, but have heard that message subtly or not so subtly over time, I do think there are also some folks who kind of blanched at it because he wasn't saying, okay, he's going to have this policy that really benefits us and we need to get behind it. He was saying, this is your obligation. It's your turn.
Yeah. And I think it's worth noting, a lot of people look at this as being a binary issue and they'll say to black voters, well, obviously she's going to be better for you. But that's not, as you mentioned, always the only calculation here. There is something to be said for withholding your support or sitting things out. We see this with a lot of supporters of the Palestinian cause in the Democratic Party where they were voting for uncommitted in the primaries when President Joe Biden was still running, kind of sending a message that their support wasn't something that could be taken for granted.
I just wanted to also add that just because voters are not as in tune with the latest polls or the latest stories as like the people on this podcast, because we're paid to do it, does not mean that they don't have memory. Biden and Harris were elected amid a racial reckoning, the killing of George Floyd, big questions about systemic racism and how it played out in our society and in government. They made promises about criminal justice reform and police reform, about voting rights. And except for an executive order here or there, not trying to downplay them, but except for those things, largely a lot of those promises, which would have impacted black men, have not been delivered on. There is no large-scale criminal justice reform. There is no large-scale police reform. Voting rights died on the vine in the Senate. And so I think that a lot of voters, a lot of African-American voters, when they look at what Biden and Harris have actually delivered on in the past years for them, they may look at them and find them coming up lacking.
And I think the Harris campaign would say, the reason these things didn't pass, the reason there's no John Lewis Voting Act is because Republicans have stood in the way of that. But that's also a tough argument because you made these promises to voters. And if you don't deliver on those, whatever the obstacles, people can judge you accordingly, which I think is perhaps something that's happening here. I also wanted to talk about her plans for the future, the things that she's now talking about doing when she's president. And a big part of that is this week we saw her agenda that's geared towards black men rolled out. Can you talk a little bit about what's in that and how that rollout has been going so far?
Well, it's still nascent. They announced it on Monday.
Right.
In a news release that also included the word black men several times over and over again. They talked about things specifically targeted at black men, like forgivable business loans for black entrepreneurs and others, about apprenticeships, more money and more funding for apprenticeship or for studying sickle cell and other diseases that specifically affect black men. She's also talked about her support for legalizing marijuana, because she thinks that the impacts of criminalization disproportionately affect black people. I think one of the things that kind of should be said, just as, a journalist who's been covering this stuff, is that a lot of the stuff that they mentioned wasn't actually new as much as it was repackaged. Mm-hmm. Things that, to be fair, would probably disproportionately benefit African Americans, especially the health-related stuff, for example. But it's things that Harris has just rolled out before in different packaging, kind of aimed at black men, saying this is how this stuff would benefit you directly and specifically.
Right. So it's not so much like these are novel new ideas so much as, look, these are the ways in which my existing agenda is specifically going to help you. So, Cleve, we've been talking a lot here about the Harris campaign's messaging, her economic agenda, her interviews, and things like that. I'm curious what you think the Trump campaign has done that's been successful on this front, and what kind of messages that you're seeing from them that have an impact on the choices that are being made right now.
Yeah. It may be a little bit scattershot from the Trump side of things, but I wonder if some of us in the chattering classes have underestimated the impact of his sometimes acerbic words about Harris and race, like the NABJ conversation where he talks about Harris, identifying as black recently for political expediency and then sort of doubling down. And he is
Which,
also,
of course, isn't actually true. She is long identified as black.
Yeah, it's wrong, right? Like she was a member of a black sorority, has identified as black for her entire life. But are people who just kind of hear that or see that on Twitter or hear it repeated at a barbershop or grocery store, are they going to do the fact checking and all of that stuff? They should. You could argue that they should, but are they going to take their time out to do that? And I think that's one of the things that I have to remind myself over and over and over again is that voters have other thoughts and have other things going on. And so if Trump puts something out there and it gets buzz, even if it's wrong or it is false or it is disinformation, that doesn't mean that everybody's going to do their homework and their due diligence to debunk that stuff. But I think writ large, Trump is leaning into this argument that Democrats take black people for granted and that they coat themselves in political correctness while not actually delivering results. And then he just always goes back to the economy under me, the black unemployment, and just spouting, sometimes facts, sometimes non-facts about the benefits that he's brought for black people while also sort of attacking, a black woman candidate.
Right. It's certainly a big question that we'll be talking about, as you mentioned, in about 3 weeks' time after this election is over. Thanks so much for talking it over with me, Cleve.
I'm going to go get a cheesesteak. No, thanks for having me.
Cleve Wootson is a White House reporter for The Post. If you want more original, deep analysis of campaign news, make sure you subscribe to my newsletter, also called The Campaign Moment. You can find a link in our show notes and at postreports.com. And as we get down the stretch run of the 2024 campaign, if you want to make sure that you are up to speed on all the latest with our news and analysis, make sure you're subscribing to the Washington Post itself. There is a link in our show notes that you should check out right now. Today's episode was produced by Laura Benshoff and mixed by Sam Bair. It was edited by Renita Jablonski and Mary Jo Murphy. We'll be back in your feed this Friday with our regularly scheduled roundtable. I'm Aaron Blake. See you Friday. How do you feel about a chicken cheesesteak?
No. I mean,
no, not at all.
There's
no place for it.
I feel about chicken cheesesteaks the same way I feel about vegetarian lasagna.
Okay.
Which is just eat the lasagna.
Yeah.
Just
if you
eat
have
the
lasagna, have lasagna.
Go for a run, eat a salad tomorrow, but don't. Why?
Yeah. Okay. I like a chicken cheesesteak. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I should have asked how you felt about it before I.